News on Terror segment tonight. While the rest of the news cycle has covered, mourned, and subsequently dismissed the terror attacks in London, to move on to more important stories like whether James Comey likes or hates Donald Trump and whether President Trump will live tweet Comey's hearing tomorrow in the Senate, some 400 individuals who fought for the Islamic State and then returned to their home nation of Britain are roaming free in the UK. And according to his own words, London's Mayor Sadiq Khan has no idea where these jihadists are. Watch.
You are mayor of the capital city where the most recent terrorist attack has taken place. How many of those 400 have come back to London?
The estimate is just over half. So when you
where are they?
When you look at the...
No, but seriously, where are they?
How are we letting people back in to the UK who haven't just been trained? They've actually fought, potentially against our troops. How are we letting them back in without knowing exactly where they are and what they're up to? Because out of all the thousands of people that we're concerned about, surely those who've actually gone to fight are the biggest risk.
Well, that's one of the reasons why it doesn't make sense for the government to be cutting resources from those...
Where are they? You're the mayor of this capital city. Where are they?
I can't follow 400 people. What I can do is make sure we have the policies, because what we can do, though, is make sure we've got the resources for the police and the experts to follow these people.
Why can't you instruct...
With me now from the Center for Security Policy, Frank Gaffney. Frank, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thank you, Liz.
Frank, that video clip is so troubling to me. I've probably watched it 5 or 6 times since I first saw it this morning. 400 individuals who I guess were born in the United Kingdom went to fight for ISIS in Iraq and Syria. They later came back to Britain. They were allowed in. In this interview, clearly they were asking, well, why don't you have the resources to follow these 400 individuals around? But Frank, I want to back up even one step further and ask, why were those 400 people even allowed back into the United Kingdom?
It's a great question, Liz, and if that were the full extent of the problem, I think it would be worrying enough. But we've learned since the most recent of these horrific jihadist attacks in the UK that there are estimated to be some 23,000 jihadists that the police are trying to monitor. So letting more of them in is crazy. I think it's one of the reasons why Donald Trump has said, you know, we don't want to be doing that here. And I hope he'll be able to protect us from that possibility, though this is now, I guess, going to be up to the Supreme Court. But in the United Kingdom, we're seeing what happens when you don't do that. 200, 400, 23,000, whatever the number is. I think what Britain is now facing and what's in prospect for us if we stay on more or less the same trajectory is no longer the threat of terrorism. It is much better described as an insurgency. And we need to be addressing it, understanding it, first of all, of course, but addressing it as such.
Right, and I mean, it's scary when you look at the numbers. That 400 number that I gave, those are the people that have actively fought and returned. There's something like 3,000 other ones who are on an active terror watch list in the UK, and then, like you said, over 20,000 others who are known to be potential risks. They have the possibility, the potential to commit acts of terror, like we saw in Manchester, like we saw in London. Absolutely horrible. But, Frank, it almost sounds too weak to say that political correctness is at fault here, because when we think of political correctness, we think of college campuses and safe spaces, and, you know, microaggressions and triggers and all that sort of nonsense, that rhetorical nonsense. But the truth of the matter is, when we get so tied up in that nonsense, we aren't able to stop recruitment. We aren't able to stop radicalization. We aren't allowed to send our police officers to monitor threats that we know are occurring in some of these radicalized mosques. I mean, is it too much to say that political correctness leads to this?
Well, it's not enough to say that. I think what actually is at work here has been a very sustained, very disciplined, and unfortunately very successful influence operation on the part of, well, Sharia supremacists, I think is the best way to describe them. The Muslim Brotherhood most prominent among them, both in the UK and here. And we're watching this play out in the United States as well. I'm sorry to say, even to some extent under President Trump, very much under his predecessors. But here's the point, Liz. If we can't be clear that what we're dealing with is something absolutely integral to the authoritative practice of Islam, not all Muslims, but the authorities of Islam say Sharia, this totalitarian doctrine, is what the faithful must not only embrace and submit to themselves, but must try to force everybody else, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, to submit to, then there's very little likelihood we're going to have those police who are at the front lines of defense, who in a classic counterinsurgency doctrine are the people who most immediately have to actually try to contest and defeat this, this insurgency, then they're toast. And in due course, unfortunately, so will we be.
Right, which is a scary prospect to think about. But I guess, Frank, talking about it in the policy sense, I mean, what does it look like? What is fighting back? What does the counterinsurgency look like? What do we need to do? What does President Trump need to do to prevent this from happening in the United States before we get to the point of all the attacks, the major attacks that we're seeing in Britain?
Well, this is an excellent question, and I would start by saying one of the things that I'm very proud of, we've been supporting at our Center for Security Policy, is a training program to provide those local law enforcement figures, police officers, sheriffs, and their deputies, with information they've not been allowed to have from our government about Sharia, about the jihadist commands, about the kinds of telltale signs that you need to look for in order to find out where it's being promoted and incubated, and the proselytization and the training. We call it radicalization. But again, Liz, so much of this is a function of what has been obscured from us by the abject determination of successive U.S. governments and certainly successive British prime ministers to rely upon the Muslim Brotherhood to tell us what we can see and what we can think and what we can know and what we can do about this.
I mean, it's absolutely shocking.
It's a formula for disaster.
Right. It's absolutely shocking when we hear reports that at least 2 of the 3 attackers in London were known to police, were on terror watch lists, that one of them was in a jihadist documentary about ISIS fighters in the UK, that another one of them had been reported for being radicalized and trying to radicalize children who were neighbors. It's shocking. I mean, it's imperative that we unshackle not only our local law enforcement, but also the FBI to be able to say, to identify what this motivation is, or sooner or later we're going to be in the same position that the UK is, and I hope that we never get there.